parked in the visitor lot. Okay. So you go past the visitor lot, that's Gardner Commons right there. If you walk just past Gardner Commons, see that corner of that building sticking out? I know. Yeah, it's at Eccles. Right. No, Spencer Fox. Is that Spencer Fox? Yeah. So it's the next building across from it is that one. Right? And so if you just basically if you walk out here, walk around, walk out the alumni, and just walk down over here, and then walk along Gardner. Yeah, so I don't know actually, because I'm on the other side of the building. So yeah, it's up on the 7th floor. No, that's probably over on the other side. But then don't. I would do it. Yep. Yeah. No, it's an easy. Maybe it'll take you. Give yourself 10 minutes. Yeah, it's the nature and health stuff. Yeah.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Had some fantastic panels. I really enjoyed the conversations, the questions, the engagement from all of you. I'm excited now for our closing keynote of day one. Dr. Amy Luers is the Global Director for Sustainability Science at Microsoft. Previously, she served as the Executive Director of Future Earth, Assistant Director for Climate Resilience and Information at the White House in the Obama administration, Director of Climate at the Skoll Global Threats Fund, and a Senior Environment Manager at Google. Dr. Luers spent the first decade of her career working in Latin America, where she co-founded Agua Para La Vida, a nonprofit organization that works with rural communities to enhance access to potable water. Dr. Luers is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and has served on committees for the U.S. Global Change Research Program and the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. She has both a PhD in environmental science and an MA in international policy studies from Stanford University and a BS/MS in environmental systems engineering from Humboldt State University and a BA in philosophy from Middlebury College. Welcome.
So, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to talk today about environmental accounting and reporting. And this might sound like a kind of boring topic. It's not. Do I need this? Yes. Okay. It's not might sound like it's not cutting edge science. Might sound like it's not cutting edge tech, or really going to be a significant contribution to addressing our planetary crisis. But I'd like to propose that I think it actually has a real influence on all three of those. But really importantly, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it here today is because I think it's a really important, to get it right, we really need to work across the scientific community, the business community, and the policy community. And I think that's part of this convening here, so I wanted to raise this as an issue that's certainly top of my mind in my life at Microsoft. So, okay, let's see here, maybe it's the wrong one. Not quite working, there we go. So let me start by sort of providing some context. As Bill said in my introduction, so you can see I'm at Microsoft. I lead the Global Sustainability Science Program, which I was brought on to start. But I've worked on sustainability issues from a wide range of sectors, from the private sector, from government, as a researcher. And one of the things that I've sort of come to believe over the years is that you really do need to work across these different sectors. And you can sort of play that integration differently when you're in different places, right? So when you're in the White House, you can be a convener in a way that you can't be when you're at Google, for example. And the role at Microsoft is very different than the role I had at Google, because our business model is different, because who we are in this space is different. And recognizing that is really important. And one thing that's really changed over the years as I've worked in this space is that businesses in general have become very central to the sustainability journey. On the one hand, it's because of reputation, right? Businesses have to have a sustainability stance to be able to have the brand, to be able to compete in this space. But increasingly also, it's because of business risks. So businesses are really seeing the risks now from climate. My example here is also on nature, but from climate risks and others. But also increasingly, businesses seeing this as an opportunity, recognizing that if a business doesn't have a strong component of not just their brand, but industry that can sort of play in this evolving market and serve the needs of the sustainability movement, then, or the sustainability transition, then they're going to lose out. And I'm leaving for last here. This issue of accounting and reporting. There's a long history of reporting and voluntary disclosure, a lot around climate, but this is stepping up very quickly and expanding and becoming much more of a regulatory process. And I'd like to suggest that I think this is really at a moment of a potential paradigm shift for how businesses do their work. And at Microsoft, we think about this a lot. So I said I was brought on to start a sustainability science program. What our program does is think about across these three sectors, and this is how we think about sustainability at Microsoft. At the core, of course, is getting our own house in order. So this is focusing, we've made a commitment to be carbon negative, water positive, zero waste, and to protect more land than we use. And so there's a component of that for strategic planning, for reviewing and guiding those strategies that my team plays a big role. There's a whole program that manages those. We don't do that. But then there's another part. There's this industry factor where customers, you might not know this about Microsoft, but customers come to Microsoft and say, for example, my team's working with a large multinational company right now, and they came to us and said, we've made a nature positive commitment, and we want you to help us build a digital platform to track and be able to manage our commitment and show the world that we've made this commitment. And one of the reasons they do that, they come to us, is because one of the parts of our sort of business model is partnership. So we convene people and then bring the sort of digital glue, if you will, to provide that intersection, to provide solutions that have a digital base. And so we bring in scientists. I brought in people from academic universities and from scientific consulting firms to say, how do we solve this problem together? And then there's, let me go back. Then there's the third bucket, which is sort of enabling conditions. So in this third bucket, it's things like research, tools, kinds of things that Bill works on, and all of you, I'm sure. But it's also policy and technologies and collaborations, coordination and collaboration among different private sector and different businesses. And so we work across all of these, and increasingly a big focus of that, not exclusively of course, but the one I want to focus on today, is thinking about environmental accounting and how we have to work across all these spaces to get it right. So maybe I'll just have a show of hands. How many people interact with environmental accounting or reporting today? Okay, so small. So just to quickly, in terms of, there are lots of ways of thinking about these different words. I want to highlight not as necessarily the definitive, but the way I'm using them today. Environmental accounting, I see as the measurement and tracking of nature contribution, Earth System's contribution to, and risks from a company's business as part of a balance sheet of sort of the planet, of the company and the planet. Whereas the reporting is very much more focused, which kind of draws from that, on what are being reported either to voluntary or to increasingly mandatory disclosure or regulatory systems. And so there are a lot, as I mentioned, of these voluntary systems and increasingly regulatory systems around climate. And it's, I've done a lot of work in this space in the context of trying to bring the data and science into a way that we can do this in a more rigorous way. There's lots of work still to be done in that space. But what I really want to focus on is the process of going, what's happening now is going beyond just climate, beyond just carbon, where looking at ecosystems, looking at water much more in depth, looking at climate risks in much more in depth, physical risks, and biodiversity and ecosystem services even as a collection of things in the nature space. And I really also want to highlight in particular the European new regulation called CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And this is a big focus for corporations right now. Even though it's a European, it expands way beyond Europe. And at Microsoft, we really think of this as like the GDPR of environment, which is that the GDPR was really the regulation that in Europe that's set for its data standards, privacy standards. And this is sort of seen as the new wave that's going to set the future for how we do reporting. And so there's a lot of focus throughout the company on how to think about this and how we can do it right, and then think about that whole spectrum of those three pillars, how we can do it right, how we can support our customers, and what do we have to do in the policy environment, what do we have to do in supporting the science, what do we have to do in supporting the technology, and what partnerships do we need to actually get this right. So in a snapshot, what CSRD, as I said, it's a European regulation, but it actually is expected to affect over 50,000 companies around the globe. And these are all the things that it reports. It's not just environment, it's also social and governance. I'm going to focus on the environment pieces, and I'm going to hone in on biodiversity and ecosystems, not because it's more important than all the others, but I think that it's one that is among the most difficult and we're perhaps the least prepared to do. So just to give you a sense of the kinds of what this, CSRD, there are lots of other voluntary efforts in this, so I'm just choosing CSRD because it's having such a big impact. But to give you a sense of, what do you have to report? What does this mean you have to do accounting of ecosystems? So these are a couple of the questions that ask of a long, you have to actually respond to 1,144 data points or something. That's what the accountant people are continuously remind me. And I'm focused on, for each one of those 1,144 data points, you have to have a whole model and understanding of the system to get that one data point. It's not like you're just going to look for one data point in a file. And so to give you an example, so one question is you go through this process and does a given activity have an impact on an ecosystem? And this is through your whole supply chain. And does a given activity have an impact on biodiversity through your whole supply chain? And it's on what type of ecosystem, to what extent, what's the extent of the ecosystem, what's the extent of the impact, what's the condition, how is this changing over time, what's the population size of the biodiversity of the species you're impacting, how is that changing over time, what about the extinction rates, how is that changing over time through your entire supply chain. And what's more, it's not just what CSRD has introduced is this idea of double materiality. So the climate accounting that has been done in the past is really focused on what climate risks, how much are you emitting, but what's the climate risk disclosure, what's the risk to your company? And this is really looking at the risks, the dependencies, and your impact on the environment. So it's much more comprehensive in scope in terms of what areas to report, but also in terms of how the multiple directions of how you relate to the environment. So I actually think that CSRD is a huge opportunity. I think I'm one of the few maybe in the corporate world that think that. because it's going to be a lot of work. But I do think that if we get it right, it's an opportunity to integrate nature into the global economy in a much more effective way, to expand rapid environmental monitoring networks, and to increase understanding of our nature and economy interactions. But the challenges are really big. And we could go down this road and waste a lot of money. There'll be a lot of people hired, there'll be a lot of startups that are developed to meet this need, but that we might not really get the information that we need that's going to really steer the companies in the right way. And so I've highlighted a few challenges, which I'll call in sort of high-level terms, guidelines gaps. That is, there's insufficient specificity in the guidelines to be able to, the standards and guidelines to be able to really tell a company what we should do and have that result in a way that's comparable and that can lead to combinations of different reports so that we can see the whole that's greater than its parts, and not just have a bunch of data that of one company that's not connected to what's reported somewhere else. The other gap is a data gap, limited access or non-existence data. And the third, which I'll call, is a skills or knowledge gap in the current workforce. So let me go through each of these briefly. So what I'm calling the guidelines gap is, so I'm sort of postulating here that one of the challenges of the guidelines gap is immaturity of the science in a lot of these issues in terms of the evolving status of our understanding of biodiversity and ecosystem services and how they're changing in interactive ways at different scales. An evolving technology, which helps us, as the technology changes, it also helps our science evolve. It helps develop new ways to set standards and guidelines. But it's changing so quickly that in some ways, the policy and the science almost can't even keep up with it. And then because of that, the immaturity of methodologies and perhaps a little bit of a disagreement in terms of methodologies. And there's been a lot of work, of course, into coordinations of this. But when you get down to the business level and how we do this, there's still a lot to be left for the person who's implementing these to choose, as we call it, sort of bring your own methodology. And the implications, I would say, for this guidelines gap is there's a risk of, these accounting won't mean anything. They'll be unreliable. They'll be uninterpretable and incompatible. And so just to unpack this a little bit more in terms of the guidelines gap, this is coming from the CSRD on ecosystems and biodiversity. And this gives you just a couple of examples, there are a whole bunch of these, of what they're asking for. So ecosystem condition, this is what their guidelines. You have to report on ecosystem condition, and then what metrics to use. They say habitat quality based on availability of resources, native species and evenness, relative invasiveness, and net primary production. But there's no other specificity on how to answer those. And similarly, for changes in structural and function and connectivity, which is one of the indicators they ask for a measurement of habitat fragmentation, habitat permeability, and baseline time series of ecosystem connectivity. And so you can imagine there's a lot of different ways to report this. And making sense of this data over time is going to be challenging unless we really have a more focused, integrated way of collecting this data and methodologies to do so. Now there have been, as I said, there's been a lot of scientific community engagement in this broader, this sort of foundational work that's been done. And I don't want to, it's been really important work, and it's gotten us to where we are. I think though there is some questions about, there's still different, lots of freedom of bringing your own methodology because getting to the real details in different places are so different. We've had this problem with carbon accounting as well. But the other issue is how do specific companies in different sectors actually carry out this accounting in different scales. One thing we don't have, for example, that we have in carbon accounting is there's different tiers of carbon accounting. And in the ecosystem space, we don't have that sort of clarity of, I'm going to do this at a higher level or a low level of specificity. And I think that's an area that could help in this area. The second gap is the data gap, and this is an example of the gaps in biodiversity worldwide from a recent paper building on the GBIF database. But even at that global level, when a multinational company is looking at their whole supply chain, to be able to access that data is, even if it exists, is very complicated. And again, you could think, well, this is how they're going to be startups, they're going to answer this question. And I do believe in 5 years there will be a lot of startups that are responding to this, making pretty maps. And we've seen this in the climate risk space. But I think, in the climate risk modeling space, I think there are a lot of startups that are sometimes using a kind of cookie cutter approach that I say, and that connection to the scientific community to really provide that rigor and understand how rigorous it is and how much more rigorous it has to be, is not there. And it's hard to really unpack that and use that information, make that information useful. So this is another area where, so funny, now it's like super sensitive. This is another area that where I think that the interaction of the scientific community is really important to be able to understand how to fill those gaps and unlock that information together with business and the policy community. The final gap that I want to focus on is the skills gap. We recently put out a report last fall that was called Closing the Sustainability Skills Gap. And we did this because at Microsoft, we found that it was very difficult to hire the staff we needed to follow through on our commitments and to work with our customers who also had increasing demands at that intersection of ecosystem science and sustainability science and digital transformation. And so we first did a study internally, and then we looked across other comparable sized companies around the world. And we found that other companies, not surprisingly, had very much the same challenge that we had, and that most hired people for business and then learned sustainability on the job. So there was training programs, and we have a training program. But what I found was really missing from that approach is what we called the sustainability fluency. That ability to not just understand the details of what you do for carbon accounting or for environmental accounting, what box you check, what number you have to fill in, what scopes you on emissions, but actually understanding that in the context of the larger ecosystems and the Earth system processes. So when you get this data in about climate risk, or when you get this data in about carbon accounting or ecosystem and biodiversity, kind of knowing what that means, knowing how to use it, and what it tells you and what it doesn't. I think that is a much more difficult thing to learn on just one training online. So I do think that there's a real opportunity for centers like this, universities like this, to really engage and collaborate in this space. So as I move to thinking about addressing these challenges, I'd like to suggest that, that there's this intersection that I think is really important, and that's that intersection of artificial intelligence and sustainability science. And especially in the area of environmental accounting and reporting. And I think it can help address all three of these gaps. And so this is a picture of sort of, broader picture unpacking how that can be in terms of thinking about both not just the integration of observation and data, but also scientific models of the world, and unpacking knowledge and from a whole range of different types of documents in a more integrated way, and then also even to help facilitate and integrate in the context of policy and standards. So I asked at the beginning how many people interact with or have heard of environmental reporting. I think there were like 2 hands. Let me ask the same question about AI. Okay, a fair amount more. So there's obviously AI is not a new thing for business. It's not a new thing for science. It's been around for a long time, and getting better steadily over the years. And it's used to boost efficiency, improve speed and consistency of services for businesses, use customer insights to inform decision making, and uncover opportunities for new products and services are some of the areas where business uses this all the time. And of course in science for accelerating discovery of materials and processes and managing complex systems. So there are a whole range of different systems, of course, that, and in the biodiversity space, it's also been used. It's not relatively new compared to some of the earlier things in other sectors, but certainly there are a wide range of things where AI is used to map species, and both in terrestrial systems and aquatic systems, and analyze that data. So this is not necessarily new. But we are in sort of a new phase of AI, where the sort of introduction of generative AI, which is not just analyzing systems and spitting something back per se, but can actually create new ideas from what has been developed in the past, and can also integrate across a lot broader types of data and information. And one of the challenges is very powerful. One of the challenges, of course, is that there's also hallucinations. It can be really wrong, and sound really right. And so there's lots of challenges with this new world that we have as well. But the reality is another interesting thing about the AI entering into this space is that the speed at which technology is changing. One of the things that I think about in the sustainability realm, of course, is we need to transform across every sector at a scale and pace we haven't seen before. And when you think about things like the technology space, the speed at which these are uptaking, where one metric in the tech world is how long it takes to get 100 million users. And the internet overall took 7 years to get 100 million users. Facebook put 4.5 years. ChatGPT took 2 months. And as we think about that speed, how do you capture that speed while, of course, doing it responsibly? How do you capture that power and that speed and doing it responsibly? I think is the real opportunity here. And I think one of the ways that's important, there's a lot of talk about things on the social sector, and that's really important. And sustainability also has those very important issues in the social sector. But one of the things I think we also have to understand is there's inequities even in the data side and the understanding of the ecological sides. And if we don't incorporate that sustainability science into some of these tools in a really effective way, I think that's actually also not responsible. So as we, I think this is a little, supposed to have, anyway, I don't know why it's not working, but Thank you. So I think we're in this sort of shift, right, in the environmental accounting and reporting space, where we've been through this period of voluntary reporting. We're still in that a little bit, but what's emerging is this mandatory reporting and accounting. And I've highlighted CSRD as sort of at the forefront of that. But if we want to sort of go to that space where we're in a world where we have integrated, we're really integrating environmental goods and services and what we know about the environment into our accounting books, like we do our financial accounting books, and we're beginning to do with the carbon, but we want to do that more broadly. I really think it's essential that we provide this integration of sustainability and science and AI to be able to accelerate that. So I think that this intersection can really help address these three gaps. In terms of guidelines gaps, one of the areas that as I said, the challenge in the guideline gap, I think is partly a part of limited understanding of some of the areas as we're still, getting to understand, well, what should you measure for biodiversity and at different scales in different places. There's a lot of disagreement in the scientific community in terms of, there's a broad agreement, but we're, how to do that and how to direct the business community to do this right in a way that hopefully can also create data for us to all advance in this space together. And so, and that idea of scientific understanding, not just seeing patterns, I think is something that, of course, isn't going to be that there's just an interpretation, but that how do you work with AI to be able to advance that scientific understanding, and especially this new area of generative AI, and in terms of how we can, I think that will become a skill that we need. I mean, I know that there's a lot of fear, and rightly so, that there are going to be jobs that are lost because of the advances of AI, and in particular generative AI, like ChatGPT. And I guess, one of the things that, while I think that is a problem and we have to think about it, one of the things that I also think we have to realize is that the people that are able to understand how to use generative AI to be better at what they do, to be able to learn and understand systems better, and that we can build it in the system to help us learn that, it's going to be those people who sort of take our jobs, right? Because they're going to help us all get smarter and understand systems better. So I think we're not there yet, but I think we do need to work towards that direction. So then in the data gap, researchers are already, of course, deploying AI and ML to fill data gaps, to fill data gaps with patterns, to fill data gaps by analyzing imagery, and we saw some of that in Rob's talk today in terms of methane, and it's also happening in the biodiversity and ecosystem realm. And also to combine those images with a whole range in a much more automated way of other types of data sources. And of course, to generate information, data, synthetic data, that can help and do that in a way that is, can help models be more effective for helping us do what we want. AI models help us be effective at what we want. And I think this intersection, to do it well, again, needs to be a real close integration of these two communities. So then the skills gap. There's, of course, a sort of training assistance. There's distilling these large reports, and we're doing a lot of work with different groups right now. How can we help use these tools to integrate and access scientific information and get that in an accessible way for businesses, but also for researchers and also for practitioners who are working in this space. And I think there's a lot of work to be done there, but I think there's a huge opportunity to help fill this skills gap. And then targeted training programs where really focusing on one thing that the Khan Academy has done and leveraging with partnership with OpenAI in this space is, instead of just teaching, having these screens of saying, let me give you a lecture, working with ChatGPT tools to actually ask questions of the students and have them learn more as they ask questions. So the ChatGPT will ask back, so that it's a learning process. And you can imagine that also in the context of, as I said, understanding how ecosystems work, what are feedbacks, and having processes where those training models are really in this interactive way, in a way that we haven't seen before. So in the context of these training and skill gaps, one of the things that we're exploring across a whole range of different sectors is what we're calling a co-pilot. And we're working deeply in these different sectors and this one is in the cybersecurity space, so that there's also a really big skills gap in cybersecurity space that we work on. We have trainings and we have different folks, but we also have this co-pilot, which is helps work through and asks questions and is targeted very specifically for a certain type of skill sets. We similarly have a co-pilot for programming on GitHub, where you can get support in writing different programs for different sectors. And increasingly, we're looking at how can we do this in the context of environmental data? And we're still at early days of this, of course, but have begun to explore, when so there's a video. Do you have to do that? Oh, there we go. So this is looking at how would you actually, in a much more ChatGPT kind of way, explore data in geospatial space data, but also in data from the literature, data from other data sources and structured data, and integrate that as you have a conversation to explore the landscape as you want to look for information in this space. So these are early days, and really in the context of what we can do in the environmental space, whether it's focused on environmental accounting or others, I think is at early days and a pretty exciting time. So I wanted to just give you a snapshot of the kinds of things that we're thinking about in this space. And I started off by saying, it might be a boring topic because it's not cutting edge science, it's not cutting edge technology, and it might not appear like it's helping to solve the big crisis that we're on. I think in the terms of cutting edge science, I'd like to suggest that there is a lot of cutting edge science that we need to understand that's about how we get things done. How do we do things, which is at the intersection of ecosystem science, at the intersection of social science, at the intersection of technology. And I think that there is a lot of learning to do about how we can do things better, and this is one space where that's true. So in terms of the huge opportunity, I really do believe that this ability to expand the integration of environmental information into our accounting. So our accounting for carbon accounting and our whole accounting system, which is expanding quickly, is moving in increasingly into our financial accounting from our sustainability. We still provide that. Hasn't done that move yet, but that is increasingly in that space. And if, as companies do that, I think it's going to be a real opportunity to say, we're kind of figuring out that next level now. What does that look like? How can we get it done? In that context, I really think we do need this collaboration between business, researchers, and policymakers to figure out what works and what doesn't work. Because at a theoretical level, we can say what's the best thing to measure. We have to also think what's practical for businesses to measure, and how do we connect those dots to what's practical and what's useful. And I'd like to, I think in the ecosystem space and more broadly, I do think time is of the essence, but especially in the ecosystem space, because we've had many years in the carbon accounting space, and we still have problems. And some would argue it's good enough, some wouldn't. I would say in the ecosystem space, we're much earlier. And there's, the next couple of years are going to be scrambling, and my guess is the first few years, the data won't mean much. But these are also the first couple years where there's going to be probably a lot of iteration and a lot of shaping, and that's why I think the time of the essence of this kind of collaboration is so important. And so just to end, I think of the path forward as innovate, collaborate, and advocate. This importance of AI and sustainability science as a collaboration I see as sort of, from my perspective, a really key driver in this. But partnerships are really important to scale, partnerships across businesses, but across academia, among businesses, and also with government institutions. And I didn't talk specifically about policy advocacy, but as we go on through this, things are going to change. Things aren't going to work. We have to really set the stage that, if you remember the 3 circles that I had there at the beginning, those enabling conditions, which is that policy context and that science, will be really important. And I do think AI is a really important part of this transition. It certainly will be at Microsoft. And of course, responsible AI will be critical. So thank you.
We have time for just a few quick questions, and we're actually going to do, I think, a roving mic for that. Questions from the audience here.
Yeah, so thanks, Amy, for such a forward-looking talk. And I think there are a number of students in the audience that I almost want to ask on their behalf, what would your message to them be? Like how, I think there are students who are very excited about this space and want to get in this space. What would your message be to them?
I think that, I guess the issue is you can work on this space and be in academia and work with the private sector. And you can also do it by going to the private sector. I guess that's what I would say. Like, you don't have to work in the space just by going to the private sector. I think that's one thing. Because I think, where I sit, there are a lot of companies now that are starting to develop science teams and climate science teams and sustainability science teams. It's really exciting to see. And so I think there will be increasingly places at companies with that either deep background in one of these accounting spaces. But I also think that there's real importance to find opportunities to work in that bridging space. I mean, I've talked to Bill, for example, really excited about, he does great work in that space. We have to be able to tap into those research centers like the Wilkes Center to be able to do that. So I think there are increasingly centers like this around the country. Wilkes is, of course, the leading edge of this, but where there are these looking to be creative in that intersection. So I think, there are those 2 paths you can take, and both, I think, are really powerful.
We have one final quick question.
Thanks so much, Amy. I'm wondering about lessons learned from the climate reporting, because, that was just one crosscut. This is an explosion to many other fields. What are the checks and balances? So when you're looking at policy, business, and sustainability science, the data that's going in and the reporting that's coming out, who's doing the compliance checking there to make sure that everyone is being held to the same standard?
Yeah, so the carbon space, we do get audited in the carbon space. People are learning as they go. We had a lot of cross-training there in that space with our auditors. So, and I think it's going to be even more of a kind of Wild West when it comes to ecosystems. So that's why I say this, I think time is so much of the essence, because it's an opportunity to shape all those things. We have to sort of define what it means to audit these, but it is explicit in these regulations that they have to be auditable. So it's kind of setting the foundation to say, new world, let's figure out how to do it, is the way I think about it.
Thank you so much. With that, thank you all for coming to day 1, and we're excited to see you tomorrow. We kick off at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, same place. Thank you.